Ethan Ramirez rubbed his weary eyes as he navigated his silver Honda Accord through the deserted streets of downtown Riverton. The digital clock on the dashboard glowed 11:48 p.m., and the temperature reading made him grateful for the car's blasting heater. Outside, a light snow had begun falling, the freezing 22 degrees Fahrenheit -6 degrees Celsius air biting at everything it touched. Ethan was mentally drained after a grueling 8-hour budget committee meeting at City Hall. As chair of the Riverton Finance Board, he'd spent the evening sparring over budget allocations for various city departments, particularly the Riverton Police Bureau. Tensions had boiled over when the department requested an increase in funds for military-grade gear, a proposal Ethan adamantly opposed. He argued that resources would be better spent on community initiatives and de-escalation training for officers. The streets were eerily quiet, broken only by the occasional car passing through the light snowfall. Ethan exhaled slowly. Already picturing his wife, Elena, leaving dinner for him in the microwave, as she often did on his late nights. Home was just 10 minutes away. And he could already feel the pull of his worn recliner and a warm plate of food. But his peaceful thoughts were shattered by the sudden flash of red and blue lights in his rearview mirror. Startled, Ethan glanced at his speedometer. It read 35 miles per hour, exactly the limit. Puzzled but composed, he signaled, slowing his car to a stop under a glowing streetlight for visibility. His father, a retired police sergeant, had drilled into him the proper steps for handling a traffic stop. 2 officers approached, one on each side of the car, their flashlights shining harshly through the windows, blinding Ethan. The officer on the driver's side tapped firmly on the glass with his knuckles, though Ethan had already begun lowering it. "License and registration," the officer barked, skipping any formal greeting. The badge on his chest read Officer Jennings. The voice carried a sharp edge, one Ethan, after years of public service, had come to recognize as the mix of authority and unnecessary hostility. "Good evening, officer," Ethan replied, his tone polite as he reached slowly for his wallet. "May I ask why I'm being pulled over?" Jennings' partner, Officer Randall, hovered near the rear passenger window, his hand conspicuously resting on his holster. An unmistakable show of intimidation. "Your taillight's busted," Jennings said flatly. Ethan frowned internally. He'd had his car serviced just last week. "I'm sorry, officer, but I believe there's a mistake. I had the lights checked." "Step out of the vehicle," Jennings interrupted, his voice suddenly louder and colder. Ethan felt a tightness in his chest but kept his voice steady. "Officer, it's below freezing, and I don't see." "I said step out of the car." Jennings barked, his tone booming through the still night. Lights flickered on in nearby apartments, and curtains shifted as curious residents peered out at the unfolding scene. Ethan's pulse quickened, but he reminded himself to stay calm. He unbuckled his seatbelt and slowly opened the door. The icy wind immediately biting through his suit jacket. Snowflakes swirled down, settling on his shoulders as his polished leather shoes crunched on the light dusting of snow. "Hands where we can see them," Randall commanded, his flashlight now locked onto Ethan's every movement. Raising his hands slightly, Ethan stood tall despite the humiliation. His sharp gaze noticed both officers' body cameras. Switched off. A direct violation of policy. A chill ran down his spine that had nothing to do with the weather. What happened next would change not just Ethan's life, but the future of Riverton's police department. But for now, standing there under the glare of the streetlight, Ethan Ramirez was simply another citizen confronting unchecked power, or so they thought. Here's the continuation with the same tone, structure, and changes applied. Officer Jennings paced in front of Ethan like a predator sizing up its prey, the snow crunching under his boots. The streetlight above cast long, exaggerated shadows of the 3 figures onto the icy pavement. In the background, a few neighbors continued watching. Phones now pressed against their windows, silently recording the scene unfolding below. "You think you're smarter than a cop, huh?" Jennings sneered, his breath forming mist in the frigid air. Arguing over a taillight? Ethan stood his ground, his face calm despite the cold that gnawed at his fingers. He was taller than Jennings. But Jennings carried himself with the arrogance of someone who expected instant obedience. "I'm not arguing, officer," Ethan said evenly. "I just think there's a misunderstanding here." Randall, still at the back of the car, snorted under his breath. "Oh, we've got ourselves a real fancy one, Jennings. Look at this car, custom seats, laptop in the back. Must think he's untouchable." Jennings smirked, stepping uncomfortably close to Ethan, their faces mere inches apart. Ethan could smell stale coffee on his breath. "Of those types," Jennings said, his tone mocking. "Think you're better than us? Above the law?" A car slowed as it passed, the driver clearly taking in the scene. Jennings turned and glared, and the car quickly sped off. The snowfall had grown heavier, blanketing the ground with a fresh, thin layer of white. Ethan's polished dress shoes were soaked through. And the cold was creeping up his legs, but he refused to flinch. "Officer, I have no intention of disrespecting you or the law," Ethan said. He thought briefly of showing his city council Idaho but decided against it. He wanted to see just how far they'd take this. "Prove it then," Jennings said, a smirk curling at the edge of his lips. "Drop and give me 20 push-ups. Right here. Now." Ethan blinked, stunned. "Excuse me?" "You heard me," Jennings barked, his voice echoing through the empty street. 20 push-ups. Call it a lesson in humility. Unless," he added, tapping the taser on his belt, "you prefer we search your vehicle for something illegal?" Randall chuckled, pulling out his phone and angling it toward Ethan, ready to record. "Come on, boss," he taunted. "Let's see those push-ups." Ethan glanced at the freezing pavement, slick with snow and ice, then back at the officers. He memorized their badge numbers. Jennings 4012, Randall 4095, before lowering himself to the ground. The moment his hands touched the frozen pavement, a sharp chill bit into his palms, needles of cold piercing through his skin. His tailored suit pants soaked through instantly, and his wedding band clinked against the icy concrete. "Count them out loud," Jennings ordered, grinning as he crossed his arms. "And don't cheat me with half measures." Ethan began. 1, 2, 3. Each time he lowered his chest to the pavement, his tie dragged through the slush, staining the expensive fabric. Randall walked around him slowly, his phone aimed like a weapon. "That's it. Look at this guy. Thinks he's a big shot." Ethan's arms began to tremble from a mix of exertion and the biting cold, but his voice remained steady. 17. 18. As he pushed up for the final count, he felt something slide from his breast pocket. His leather wallet hit the ground with a soft thud, flipping open as it landed. The gleam of the gold City of Riverton Council seal caught the light, unmistakable even in the dim glow of the street lamp. Jennings?" Randall's voice faltered as he stepped closer, his flashlight illuminating the ID card. "You might want to take a look at this." Jennings' smug expression evaporated in an instant. He bent down, his eyes widening as he read the words printed on the card. Ethan Ramirez, City Council Member, Chairman of the Police Oversight Committee. The shift in their demeanor was almost comical. Jennings stumbled back, suddenly rigid, his earlier confidence replaced with panic. "Sir. I'm sorry. We didn't know." Ethan pushed himself up slowly, brushing the snow and slush from his soaked suit. His fingers were numb, his knees scraped. But his calm expression never wavered. "Didn't know I was what?" he asked quietly, his voice carrying a cold edge. Randall looked as though he wanted to disappear. We thought it was a routine stop, sir." "A routine stop," Ethan repeated, nodding slowly. For a broken taillight that isn't broken. With body cameras that are mysteriously off. Neither officer responded. Jennings opened his mouth to speak, but Ethan held up a hand. I suggest you write detailed reports about this incident, Ethan said, his voice calm but firm. Include everything, why you pulled me over. Why your cameras were off, and why you felt the need to humiliate a citizen in the middle of the night. The officers stood frozen as Ethan bent down and retrieved his wallet, wiping the snow off the city council badge. Have those reports on my desk by 9 a.m. tomorrow, Ethan continued. And, Officer Randall, I'd hold on to that video if I were you. Deleting evidence is a crime. Randall swallowed hard, his hand hovering nervously over his phone. Ethan turned, his wet shoes squishing against the snow, and climbed back into his car. The heater blasted warm air onto his frozen skin. But it couldn't touch the icy anger burning in his chest. As he drove away, he caught one final glimpse of Officers Jennings and Randall in his rearview mirror. They stood under the streetlight. Motionless, like statues in the falling snow. They had no idea that their actions would lead to the most sweeping police reforms Riverton had ever seen. Ethan gripped the steering wheel tighter, his mind already formulating tomorrow's plans. Tonight had been a humiliation. But tomorrow would bring accountability. Here's the continuation with the same tone, structure, and style. Ethan Ramirez pulled into his driveway, the headlights cutting through the gentle snowfall. The house was dark except for the porch light. A small beacon that Elena always left on for him. He sat in the car for a moment, the heater blasting as the events of the night replayed in his mind. The mocking laughter. The feel of frozen pavement biting into his hands. The way Randall recorded it like it was entertainment. Ethan's phone buzzed on the passenger seat, a missed call from Elena and a news alert flashing across the screen. Viral video, councilman forced to do push UPS in the snow by Riverton police officers. He tapped the alert, and the shaky footage filled the screen. The clip had already been viewed over 30,000 times in less than an hour. In the video, Jennings' voice carried clearly, "Drop and give me 20. Ethan watched himself on the ground, his suit ruined. While Randall's voice mocked him from behind the camera. The anger he had bottled up all night simmered dangerously close to boiling over. Ethan exhaled deeply, pushed open the car door, and walked to the house. Wet footprints followed him up the porch steps. Inside, the faint glow of the kitchen light greeted him, and there was Elena, still awake, sitting at the dining table with her phone in her hand. Elena, Ethan started softly, but she stood up, crossing the room to him. I saw the video, she said, her voice trembling with both anger and concern. She reached out, gently touching his soaked suit jacket. Are you okay? I will be, Ethan replied, his voice calm but carrying the weight of what he had to do. But we're going to make sure no one else goes through this again. He kissed her forehead, grabbed his laptop from his bag, and settled into his home office. The clock on the wall read 1:07 a.m. But sleep wasn't an option tonight. He opened his email and began drafting an emergency notice. To Riverton City Council, Police Oversight Committee. Subject, Emergency Meeting, Police Misconduct Review. Time, 9 a.m. Location, Council Chambers. Agenda, Immediate review of officer conduct and police accountability policies. Next, he called his assistant, Clara Shaw, who, to her credit, answered despite the late hour. Clara, I need everything on my desk by morning. Every complaint filed against officers Jennings and Randall for the past 3 years, body camera compliance reports, and traffic stop statistics. Yes, Mr. Ramirez, Clara replied without hesitation, her voice already shifting into work mode. Anything else? Pull all video footage from the traffic cameras at Main and Clark Street between 11:30 p.m. and midnight tonight, Ethan added. And get me a list of all pending misconduct cases we've had ignored this year. I'll have it ready, Clara promised. Ethan leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. His father's words echoed in his mind, "Power can corrupt even the best intentions." By 8:30 a.m., Riverton City Hall was a hive of activity. Reporters swarmed outside, cameras ready, and citizens filled the halls with murmurs of outrage. Inside, Ethan sat at the head of the large oak table in the council chamber, a thick stack of reports neatly arranged in front of him. Clara walked in with fresh coffee and another folder. "It's worse than we thought," she said, setting it down. "Jennings and Randall have had 17 formal complaints between them in the past 2 years. None were properly investigated." Ethan nodded, his expression hardening. "And the body cameras? They reported malfunctions on 31 occasions in the last 6 months, 10 times the average of other officers," Clara said grimly. At 9 a.m. sharp, the chamber doors opened, and the room fell silent. The police chief, Rober. Officers Jennings and Randall followed closely behind, now dressed in their formal uniforms. They looked far less confident than the night before. The room was packed, council members, citizens, reporters, and families of individuals who had filed complaints over the years. Ethan stood, his voice calm but firm as it echoed through the chamber. "Let's begin." The next 2 hours would shake Riverton to its core. Ethan began with the facts. Officers Jennings and Randall initiated a traffic stop last night under false pretenses. They claimed my taillight was broken. It wasn't. The large screen behind him lit up with traffic camera footage showing Ethan's car driving perfectly, taillights glowing as they should. Next, he brought up their body camera compliance records. These officers reported malfunctioning cameras over 31 times in 6 months. Coincidentally, during traffic stops where complaints were later filed. Gasps filled the room. Chief Gaines shifted uncomfortably in his seat, aware of the damning evidence piling up. "And last night," Ethan continued, his voice hardening, "they forced me, a citizen of this city, to do push-ups in the snow as a form of humiliation. This isn't just misconduct. This is abuse of power." He clicked play on the video captured by the bystanders. Jennings' voice, 20 push-ups, rang through the chamber like a gavel strike. Randall's mocking laughter followed, silencing the room. When the video ended, Ethan turned to the 2 officers. "Officers Jennings and Randall, do you have anything to say?" Jennings' face was pale. "Sir, we didn't know who you were." "That's the problem," Ethan interrupted sharply. "You thought I was just another citizen you could bully without consequence. And how many others have faced this same treatment because they didn't have a badge or a title to protect them?" The chamber erupted in murmurs of agreement. Families in the audience nodded, many with tears in their eyes. Chief Gaines stood up, his voice shaking. "Mr. Ramirez, this is unacceptable. These officers will be suspended pending a full investigation." Ethan shook his head. "Suspension isn't enough. Effective immediately, we're implementing sweeping reforms." He held up a document. "This proposal includes mandatory body camera usage with severe penalties for tampering, civilian oversight for all misconduct complaints, and retraining in de-escalation techniques for every officer on the force." The council members began to nod, one by one. The vote was unanimous. By noon, the news had spread. Jennings and Randall had resigned, and the Riverton Police Department faced its biggest overhaul in decades. Ethan stepped outside City Hall, the cold air hitting him as camera flashes went off like fireworks. "Councilman Ramirez, do you feel vindicated?" a reporter shouted. Ethan paused, looking directly into the cameras. "This isn't about me. It's about every citizen who deserves to be treated with dignity and respect. We're building a city where no one fears those sworn to protect them. This is just the beginning." As the crowd applauded, Ethan spotted his father standing quietly at the back, his old police captain's hat in hand. He gave his son a proud nod. Sometimes, Ethan thought, the most humiliating nights can lead to the most transformative mornings. Here's the continuation, showcasing the long-term impact of Ethan's reforms. 6 months later, Riverton was a city transformed. On a bright, clear morning, Ethan Ramirez stood at the steps of the newly renovated Riverton Community Safety Center. A state-of-the-art facility that replaced the outdated precinct where Jennings and Randall had once worked. The building's glass walls reflected the morning sun, symbolizing the transparency Ethan had fought so hard for. Inside, civilians and officers worked side by side, resolving disputes, discussing reforms, and rebuilding the community's trust in law enforcement. Ethan adjusted his tie as his assistant Clara handed him a tablet. "Numbers just came in," she said with a smile. Ethan glanced at the screen and grinned. Civilian complaints against police were down 60%. Use of force incidents had dropped by 45%. And public trust surveys reported the highest ratings in Riverton's history. Behind him, news cameras began rolling as citizens gathered, eager to see the results of their fight for justice. Chief Gaines, who had initially resisted the reforms, now stood beside Ethan as a firm advocate for the changes. He approached Ethan, extending a hand. "I was wrong," Gaines said honestly. "You were right to push us. We're better because of it." Ethan shook his hand. "It wasn't just me, Chief. It was all of us." Inside the safety center, things operated differently. New officers underwent rigorous 6-month training programs that included de-escalation techniques, community service hours in shelters, schools, and elder care facilities, bias recognition courses, ride-alongs with trained civilian liaisons to see firsthand how the community viewed their role. Every officer now wore body cameras, monitored regularly to ensure compliance. Tampering with footage was grounds for immediate dismissal. A civilian oversight board, composed of community members, reviewed every citizen complaint. Decisions were binding, not advisory. Ethan's father, retired Captain James Ramirez, had also played a key role. His decades of experience helped design the training programs. He now stood at the front of Riverton's police academy, addressing a graduating class of recruits, one of the most diverse in the city's history. "Wear that badge with honor," Captain Ramirez told them. "It's not a weapon, it's a promise to protect and serve your community." In the front row, one recruit sat taller than the rest, Daniel Jennings, the younger brother of the disgraced officer. Unlike his brother, Daniel had embraced the reforms, determined to rebuild his family name by serving the right way. At the Riverton City Council's annual meeting, Ethan presented the 6-month report. "In the past year," he said, "we've seen a city that was once divided by fear come together through trust. Officers are building relationships with the people they serve. Residents are no longer afraid to call for help. And those who wear the badge wear it with pride and purpose." The chamber erupted into applause. Citizens who had once raised their hands in anguish now clapped with hope. The reforms soon caught national attention. Cities across the country reached out to Ethan for guidance on implementing similar programs. Riverton's community-first model became the gold standard for policing reforms. Ethan traveled to Washington, D.C. to speak before Congress, sharing Riverton's story of change. "We proved that accountability and respect can coexist," he told them. "The most powerful policing comes not from force, but from understanding." 1 year after the incident that changed everything, Ethan stood at the corner of Main and Clark Street, the same spot where he'd once been humiliated in the snow. Now, a small plaque stood there. In honor of those who stood for justice and sparked change. Riverton Community Safety Center, EST 2025. Beside the plaque, a group of officers played basketball with neighborhood kids. A young boy laughed as an officer hoisted him up to make a slam dunk. Ethan watched with a quiet sense of pride as his father approached, hands in his pockets. "Quite a difference, huh?" Captain Ramirez said. Ethan nodded, his gaze fixed on the scene before them. "It's what I always hoped for, officers and citizens working as partners. The two men stood side by side as the setting sun painted the streets in gold. Riverton wasn't perfect, but it was better. A city that had once been defined by its divides now stood as a beacon of reform and cooperation. Sometimes, Ethan thought, 20 push-ups in the snow could set off a chain reaction that changed the world. And this time, that change would last.